there's a much longer history of Canada's role in the impoverishment of the African continent. And in the book, I trace that history back to the transatlantic slave trade and Canada's role in the transatlantic slave trade. And most discussion about the transatlantic slave trade focuses on those who have been stolen, those who were enslaved. There's less focus on the impact of the transatlantic slave trade on African societies, right? On different communities and nations, particularly in West Africa, but also in Central Africa, which were greatly destabilized, increased ethnic conflict from hundreds of years of warfare, largely generated by the slave trade and the exchange of slaves for British manufactured guns, among other dynamics. So the transatlantic slave trade was incredibly hard on African societies, and it's part of what paved the way for European colonialism of the late 1800s. It weakened African societies to enable European colonialism of the late 1800s. There were slaves in Canada for African slaves for 200 years. It was legal to enslave Africans. There were Canadians, within quotations, that participated in the British attempts to suppress the great Haitian slave revolution of 1791. And the naval base in Halifax was very much used to strengthen the British, obviously a British base at that time, to put down the slave revolts in the Caribbean at that time. And most significantly, there was a great deal of wealth generated in the Atlantic provinces providing cod for Caribbean slave plantation owners. And basically, the plantation owners in the Caribbean didn't want to devote any of their land to foodstuff for their slaves. They wanted it all for cash crops, primarily sugar. But they needed a source of high protein, salty, cheap source of food to keep people working 16 hours a day. And a big chunk of that food came from Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. And it began a major trade relationship between primarily Halifax and the Caribbean slave plantation economy that went on for decades and decades. So there was a significant amount of wealth generated in the Caribbean, or in the Atlantic provinces, from the trade with the Caribbean slave plantation economies.